Hello, this is Alum. I'm back for a Milestone 10 review and a review of the Humble Beginnings event. Start off with the introduction here, and I'll mention that this is quite a long video. For most people, you'll probably want to watch the first 7 or 8 points on this slide and then maybe the final thoughts. Most of the center content is more for hardcore Mirandus fans that are interested in theory crafting and potentially improving their gameplay. Looking through this here, there's a updated map of Narrow's Landing, as the previous one I was using is quite out of date at this point. Fall damage was recently implemented with Milestone 10, so I go into how that affects one and a bunch of videos of common places you would expect to fall from. They also added the potion class of shops, so potion shop and potion stand, and I'll show you where those are and how that can be used. The big thing, of course, for this milestone is the addition of Skywound Mine. So there's a significant video on showing that whole zone in addition to a new map and its relation to Narrow's Landing. Since the last milestone, there's also been significant AI changes for both the Alpha Buck and the Wisp mini bosses. They become much more aggressive, so I show how to defeat them. Something noted from the last event was face tanking the Goblin Brute, and as far as I've seen, I was really the only person to be doing this, so I go into detail on how to do this effectively and what you need in order to do so. After that, we have a bunch of new event NFTs, and that's for the most recent Humble Beginnings and the upcoming one currently labeled as Desperate Measures. And we go over the leaderboard and how that's looking for the last event, some strategies for that event and for future events. For future events and rewards, what kind of events we could have, something other than potentially just Gala tokens. Go into the Brute Club and how the drop rate has been increased and who has it and where they've acquired it. The Chaotic Trace and what that can be potentially used for. Current issues associated with Materium, how to make it more useful in the sinks in the game at present. And what I call a perfect gear slide. So if you have all the best gear, what does that look like, so people know how to potentially gear up their characters. Due to a glut of additional materials and nothing really to spend them on once you're fully geared, I go into potentially upgrading and some sinks to make use of that. After that, we have a list of the 4 dungeons and some information related to that. Upcoming, we also have fake walls, and we talk about some parkour in the various different locations. Then we talk about the potential for having rare drops on other mobs other than, say, just the Goblin Brute. Some issues with spawning and mob AI, and I go into that. Finishing up with a bug slide, certainly picked out the most significant ones, and ending with my final thoughts as per the norm. Here is the new and updated Narrow's Landing map, and I created the original map. However, there's been quite a few changes over the last 11 months since I've created that map, so I've highlighted a few of them. First off, I outlined all the regions for the major resources that people are interested in. So cotton, which is in blue, tin, the 3 locations, you can see the Wolf Cave 2, the Brown Goblin Camp, and the 2 places in the Green Goblin Camp for the tin, and the copper, which is along the Yellow Goblin Camp and around the Large Goblin Camp. I also added event brute spawns, which is the red B, and those are the 4 major camps and where they spawn for the events. Outside of events, there's also 3 other current spawn locations, which are fairly rare, but you do see them occasionally. Also of note, you can have double spawns outside of events, and that may continue into events in the future, and that includes the cave in the Large Goblin Camp, the Stonehenge area just south of the Brown Goblin Camp, and in the first Wolf Cave. Now, the major pathways, which are yellow lines, show all the major routes that people can walk. And I would like to make note that the line going from the Green Goblin Camp south to Outpost 1, the line going from the Yellow Goblin Camp west towards the Brown Goblin Camp, and the line going from the brown goblin camp southeast towards the yellow goblin camp. Those are all one-way directions, which essentially you jump off a cliff to do that, and there's shortcuts to continue on your route instead of backtracking through the entire camp. Also labeled are barley, which is evergreen, the grain stand, which only occurs in the village of the Earl and is important to mill the barley, and the 3 cemeteries, which are the Outpost 1, Outpost 2, and in the village of the Earl. I also remove the alpha buck from here because the alpha buck can spawn anywhere on the map, not just where the wisp is, and the wisp is next to his waterfall where he's listed. The other new thing that I've added is the Skywound Mine entrances, and there's a west entrance in the valley area, and there's an east entrance going up a hill with switchbacks into a mine area. So I'm going to be referring to places and locations on this map quite considerably. I started with this just for ease of understanding. So fall damage was just recently introduced. It can happen in various amounts depending on how far you fall. Something that's also interesting is that if you jump off of a ledge, you get a little additional height, and that tends to cause a little additional damage. Now they've also introduced potions, which we'll go into in a bit here, but the one that's related to fall damage is the Lesser Potion of Soft Landing, which can be crafted at the potion shop or at the potion stand. Now I was able to stack it to at least 100, which is something that's new in this particular build, where you can put items in your hotbar past 100. And using the potion gives you a 60-second buff, and it doesn't negate fall damage, instead it decreases it by half. So let's say a normal fall damage would do 20 damage, then it does 10 instead. Also, the fall damage I've tested doesn't contribute to durability loss to either weapons or armor. These are fairly cheap to make, requiring 6 barley, which is evergreen, and only 1 cotton, and you farm 2 cotton at a time per node, so these are fairly easy to obtain. Now the other thing that's interesting is that places that you typically wouldn't survive, say doing more than 100 or more than 130 damage, taking this can make you survive it. So you can change lethal damage into non-lethal damage. So there's a few places that are highly useful within Narrow's Landing, and potentially more within Skywound Mine once it's more developed. That is jumping from each of the goblin camps. So the shortcuts from the brown goblin camp down, from the yellow goblin camp off that cliff, and from the green goblin camp to Outpost 1. And I described those in the Narrow's Landing updated map. The other places within the brown goblin camp, at the very top you can jump all the way down to where the brute spawns, and the cheese spot next to Skywound Mine's east entrance near the green goblin camp, you can jump down and use the potion there as well. So here's a series of videos of falling, first from the mid-level in Mother's Cave, or brown, which I jumped down using without a potion, and then using a potion from the very top, which shows you can see the damage taken there. And the last one is jumping off the back towards yellow, and this is again from Mother's, or the brown cave, and you can see the damage taken there. Now this one here is jumping off the back of the yellow cave, taking no damage at all because I land in a tree. So if you're short on potions, you can do that. Otherwise, if you have over 100 health and you use a potion, you can just barely survive it, because it does 101 damage or 202 base damage. This is jumping down off of green towards Outpost 1 without a potion. And this is the last one just for fun, jumping off of the top part of Skywound Mine all the way down to the entrance where Narrow's Landing is, into the water, which you cannot survive even with max health and a potion. Okay, on to Potion Shop and Potion Stand. These two buildings, you can see the Potion Shop on the left, which is only in the village of the Earl, and the Potion Stand on the right, which are in both Outposts 1 and 2, kind of towards the back. And it's important to note the Potion Shops in general are the highest rarity of building class. only comparable with Outfitter and Jeweler. And the 5x5, which is the potion stand, are of uncommon rarity of 200 total. The 10x10 potion shop is rare rarity and 100 total. The large potion shop, which is a highly desired item, which typically sells on prices comparable to even some villages, is of legendary rarity, and there's only 10 total. And I have one of those 10. Now, at the present, there's only the lesser potion of soft landing, which was added with this milestone. However, they are planning to add additional potions in the future. And in MMORPGs, potions typically come in many forms. Health, energy, damage, speed, and resistance are quite common, and I would expect to likely see all of those and potentially more at some point in the future. Now in this video it shows the various places. So here is the potion shop in the village of the Earl. And the point here is just to have a good look around and see how it's designed. It looks like a potion shop. There's potions you can interact. You can craft the potion, lesser potion of soft landing. Here is in the outpost, and we're looking at a potion stand, which is the 5x5 version. And we can have a good look around. You can even go around the back of that and kind of pretend you're a merchant if you so desire. Now we're starting to get into the really interesting things. So on the left hand side is a map in the proper orientation based on the Unity coordinates and more or less to scale of Skywound Mine. So on the far left is the east entrance, which probably doesn't make sense to most people at this point because that's on the west part of the map, but we'll come to that in a second. And on the far right is the west entrance there. Now where it says lookout 1, lookout 2, and lookout 3, those were somewhat exaggerated just to tell them apart from the normal path. And you also have a kind of a treasure area in the very top and the boss room, which I'm assuming is the boss room, in the dead center of the map. Now some key points of interest. Choke points obviously in the dead center and the very south in that big V-shaped corridor. And that goes from one side of the mine to the other. Lookout 3, north of Lookout 2, and the boss chamber are all quite far from both entrances, so you could expect likely bosses, mini-bosses, treasures, resource nodes, etc. in those locations, as they're the hardest places to get to. Now on the far right here I have a empty map of Narrows Landing, and I have the Skywound Mine Map placed over it in the same orientation. It's important to note that the west entrance in Narrows Landing actually enters the east side of Skywound Mine, and the east entrance in Narrows Landing enters the west side of Skywound Mine. Also of interest is the west entrance is quite wide in Narrows Landing, so you would expect in the zone of Skywound Mine it would be quite wide, but it's the actual opposite. It's actually really narrow. And the east entrance in Narrows Landing, which is really narrow, once you get in Skywound Mine it's really wide. So I get the impression that this is somewhat a mistake, given that not alone do they not match what it looks like from the outside, but their positional coordinates are off as well. Other than that though, this is an accurate map for all intents and purposes. I will be making a much more accurate map using my map program at some point in the future when this is more finalized, something a little closer to being on par with the quality that you're seeing of my Narrows Landing map. The second slide on Skywound Mine, we have the two different entrances to Skywound Mine as they appear while standing in Narrows Landing. So on the left we have the west entrance, and as I mentioned, that takes you to the far southeast of the zone, which is on level with the water, and you can actually go into the water, which is interesting. It's the only place in the game so far where you can actually walk in water, and that's at the very lowest elevation. And on the right side, the east entrance takes you to the highest elevation in the Skywound Mine zone, which is fairly close to the end boss area. So if you want to simply rush to the end boss, you're going to want to take the east entrance, which is going up towards the switchbacks up to the mine entrance in Narrows Landing. Now, some interesting scenes I've seen within Skywound Mine. First, you have these black mine shafts, and I've noted two of them. And when you're in the zone, it appears as though you could probably go into them, but you can't actually go into them. Which makes me think that in the future they could be portal areas to new zones, or maybe even safe spots where you could potentially put a deed within the mountain even. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with those. In the center, that's where I'm quite certain is the end boss location, is the hardest place to get to on the map. It's a big open area. There's a big kind of throne pedestal with a bunch of braziers on top and a high ceiling. In the most recent news report, they referred to the boss of Skywound Mine as entering into Gruul's Lair. And Gruul's Lair is famous being of the same name in World of Warcraft's first 25-man raid, which happens to be within its first expansion, the Burning Crusade. And in that, the boss is a large Gron, which is kind of like a large Cyclops-looking creature. And it's possible that that could be the boss here, although it's a little small to reasonably fit him. My expectations is probably more along the lines of a goblin boss, potentially even goblin mother. We'll have to see. In other areas, there's a bunch of treasure chests strewn throughout the zone, and the one on the right is a particular ornate area of treasure chests with a bunch of other treasures and the like. And it's near the end boss's chamber, but you have to go out of your way to get to it. So I do think that this could be of some significance, and right in the area before you reach that treasure hoard area, there's kind of an open area, which is suggestive of potentially some traps or maybe a mini boss or something of the like. Okay, and here's the start of a long video showing all of Skywound Mines. We're starting in the first outpost. We're leaving the west entrance to the first outpost and hugging the wall. We're currently just south of where the Green Goblin camp is. And straight ahead of us is the Yellow Goblin camp, and you can kind of see a bunch of yellow goblins there on the left. Now we're turning north, going to a little higher elevation. Again, still just hugging that wall all the way around. Once you get to here, you can go left or right. I typically go right, as we saw here, just because it's easier, especially if you don't have a lantern of the sun and it's dark. This is by far the easier way to go. If we go right there, that is the way to the east entrance, Skywound Mine, but we're going to go to the shorter and closer area, which is the west entrance. So we took a left at that fork, and you go straight across this big open empty valley here, and you can use the fire on the right there as a guide, and where it says to Skywound Mine. So this is the west entrance to Skywound Mine. And now we're in Skywound Mine, and we look around. If we were to turn left when we first entered, we could have went into the water. I didn't actually show the water in this video simply because there's literally nothing down there, but it does very much remind me of the Moradon area with the really shallow water and the Hydra boss. So something like that could be quite interesting to be added at some point. Now, the Skywound Mine dungeon is very linear, despite it not seeming like it when you're first in there. So there's a few places where you can kind of get turned around, but those for the most part are only dead ends. So as you can see, there's a lot of vertical, and we actually go all the way up there that we could see. So we follow along. Now these railroad tracks you kind of get stuck on every once in a while. There's no mobs or harvestables in the zone as of yet. And on the right there we can see one of what I referred to as kind of the black entrances. Now we're going to our first outlook here, which I referred to as Outlook 1. And it kind of goes down the edge of the cliff. And it comes to an end point here. Now, will they add something from this point on here? Maybe a bridge, maybe a zip line. Maybe some resource nodes, potentially some parkour across that area there that we just saw. There's a lot of potential. They have said that this isn't a 100% finished zone, in terms of its actual design, although this is very close to what we're going to see in the final iteration. There are a few major landmarks, and that wheel there is one of them, and that branches off towards, we see, outlook number 2, which is a bit of a larger outlook area compared to the first one that we were at. Now, for the most part, you can't actually go on to any of those other platforms. And this again just kind of ends in an area here. And I could expect there to be maybe some resource nodes, some mining for the new armor set that's going to be introduced. So we'll backtrack. So these areas here, like I said, you can kind of get turned around if you're not careful. But you don't actually have to come down here. You can just continue on the linear pathway to wherever it is you're looking to go within Skywound Mine. So continuing on past the large wheel, we enter another mine shaft area, and there's 3 major areas of these mine shafts, and they're pretty much at the same Z coordinate for the most part. In 3 major routes. There's kind of a west, a central, and an east mine shaft, and they're all vertical within the zone. And there's also not really anything in any of them. They're kind of just connectors from one larger area to another. Also of note, I think they've adjusted the amount of energy used while sprinting. I was running out of energy constantly, which is something that hasn't really been an issue previously. Now this here is the northeast of the zone. It's a very large open area, which again you can expect probably to have a mini boss, likely in this little encampment here. At the very least some mobs and maybe some treasure, which would be nice to see. It does take a little bit of time to get here, so this area right here is where I would expect something of significance. Potentially like a mini boss. Now, exiting this area, we also have these little kind of stone crossings, and those demarcate various areas. And once we have more of this zone designed out, and treasures and harvestables and mobs and such, I'll adjust things on the map to name these areas so it's easier to find things. And we're now going south, and we can see we're going through the second of these kind of like vertical mine shaft areas. And again, there's nothing really within them for the most part. Maybe you want to get paled on those railroads. So I'm sprinting this entire time, so this is quite a large place. Now we're getting up quite high here, and this is the area that I'm referring to as Lookout 3, and this is definitely a larger lookout area, which again could easily have like a mini boss or something. We can look all the way down there, and in my fall video I actually jumped from this area, so this is too high to survive. But it does allow for potentially some parkour. If you were to slow fall down to various ledges, you might be able to survive in that way. More testing will be required to do that, but as you can see, there's a lot of edges, and that's the entrance that we started at a few minutes ago. So we've come all the way up around through there, you can see the path that snakes around and it goes through the area there and then loops back around. So we're heading back towards the main pathway. This is now going north. Try to help people orient themselves as to what all this looks like. And this map is very large. It takes up almost the full 1 square kilometer, so it's on par with the narrowest landing zone in terms of total size. Oh, we have another player here kind of exploring around as well. So this area here, there's not a whole lot in there. Now, it does take a long time to get around this zone. Imagine when there's actually mobs and traps and everything. This is going to be quite the ordeal. And oh, another player. Who's this one? Magic. So you got these little hanging bones that rock back and forth as well. It's kind of interesting. So now this is one of what I call the connector, and this area connects the east part of Skywound Mine to the west part. And again, there's not a whole lot in here, but I do expect this area to have a considerable amount of traffic, considering that to go from the west to the east, this is literally the only way you can do it. So if they ever add PvP to the game, I kind of expect this place would be quite busy. And that there is the second of these black entrances, and I test to see if you can go in, and you definitely cannot, at least at the present. So here's another area where you can kind of choose which direction to go, and if we take the right path over this way, this is now going north, and this is the westernmost mine shaft area, kind of those vertical mine shafts that I've been mentioning. And as you can see, there's lots of these hanging, swinging skulls, which are interesting for the general aesthetic in this region. I do find it odd that the actual rail, look how nice and clean those are. No rust, nothing. It's obviously very well kept. So you come into this large area here, and this is in the northwest of the zone. You have these large pillars that go all the way to the top of the cavern. I expect there to be probably a significant number of stronger mobs in this area, because this area is en route to the end boss's area. And they did mention you're going to have some more brutes and stuff, so I'd expect this place to have a bunch of brutes of the various types, the sword brute, the club brute, probably the spear brute. This here is a short little cave. It doesn't really go anywhere, it just reattaches to the area that we were just in. Maybe a slight shortcut of a few seconds instead of walking around. As you can see, quite a large high ceilings in here. Lots of little encampments. Again, one of these little area dividers that breaks from this area into kind of the what I expect to be the end boss's area. Now, you can go left there, and we'll go there in a second. So now we've entered to what I consider the end boss's cavern or chamber. And on the right side there, which is west, there's also kind of a lake that you can jump down into, and you can't survive if you actually jump into it. See if I actually take a look down. You can see kind of down there a little bit, but anyway, way down there is a little lake that you can jump into. So we're in the very middle of the map now, and this is where I would expect the end boss to be. And it kind of reminds me of Emperor Thorison's area within Blackrock Depths instance in World of Warcraft. Now, could a ground boss be here? Potentially. It's certainly high enough, but the surface area on the floor isn't all that large. Could you fit? Yes, you definitely could fit a ground boss, but something smaller like the Goblin Mother would seem to be likely more appropriate, but only time will tell, of course, to see what we actually have. Now we're going further north into the zone, and this actually starts going down. Of note, there's no area where you're on top or below anyone. This zone could technically be made just all flat. You don't actually crisscross over anyone, which I think is a lost opportunity with verticality. Now, as you can see, this is what I call the treasure area. There's lots of treasure chests of various types. There's also a bunch of rocks in the back there, which I think could be a good place to fight in this little area in front as well. So we're going to backtrack out of the treasure hall, back into the main chamber where the boss room is. And then we're going to backtrack even further to where we took the fork to head into this area, into the final area within the Skywound Mine zone. So again, this is just an area that we've already come from. We're just backtracking. That's that little cave on the right that we went through. This is where we would have come if we didn't go through that cave, which is exactly the same area. So like I said, the cave doesn't really add a whole lot. Now, once we go through this western vertical mine shaft area, we'll be back to the area where we branched off from earlier. And as you can see there, I kind of got stuck on those railroad tracks, which could be an issue once there's mobs in here. I can see you kind of backing away and then getting stuck and then absolutely getting wrecked by mobs because you're stuck on railroad tracks. And as you can see, this is quite a large place. It takes a good 15 plus minutes of non-stop sprinting just to travel around it. So very, very large zone. Also of note is that the sky is accessible in many places, so exemplars like the Bright Sun, who gets their abilities from sunlight, should be able to use their abilities pretty much in most places within this zone. So now we're kind of going to the southwest of the zone. And we're going to see here that this is the other entrance from Narrows Landing to the Skywound Mine, where it says to Narrows Landing. And as I mentioned before, this area is really wide, but when we get on the other side of this area is actually really narrow. So that's why I think they mistaked the entrances, and they probably should be switched in terms of their location. So we'll exit here. And we're at the very top of where the green camp is. And this is kind of the cheese spot at green, and far in the distance you can see the entrance to the other Skywound mine, the west entrance. The Alpha Buck on the left and the Wisp on the right had their AI significantly changed. Previously, you would attack them maybe a few times and they would just run away the entire time, which wasn't really much of a threat. That has changed significantly, especially the Alpha Buck. That is the absolute bane of people trying to gear up a newbies. I recently geared up a new character. I didn't realize just how much of a problem these guys were. And they can be anywhere. Like in this view here, you can see he's in the village of the Earl. You could be like farming some barley and then one or two hits he like kills you. He's much more aggressive. He does still run occasionally, but he tends to run for shorter durations of time. Of note, he does deal crush damage, and he's weak against pierce damage, so you want to be using the full bronze brigandine set if you have it, the spear, and a dragon or bald eagle pet. Now, of note, both the Alpha Buck and the Wisp are special mobs, meaning that they do a minimum of 10 damage instead of the 1 damage that other mobs like Bucks and Goblin Archers, Goblin Hunters typically would do. So, using, say, a dragon and bald eagle pet, if you have the full set of bronze brigandine armor, doesn't reduce your damage any further because you've already reduced it as much as you can. Now, the Alpha Buck on the left drops 300 Materium with every single kill, 2 lesser bone marrows, and usually some other things like some meat or hides, etc. Now the Wisp on the right, he only drops Materium. He's actually a really good Materium farm if it was worth farming Materium. He drops between 100 to 1000 Materium per kill, and the average is about 600. Now the Wisp used to spawn at the Wisp waterfall back in the original Narrows Landing, and also in the first milestone of the new Narrows Landing. And then they changed it so he started spawning at the 4 goblin camps. However, he started getting stuck like everywhere. So they've changed him back to only spawning near the Wisp waterfall again. Now previously, once he lost 10% of his health, he would just run away. Now he fights to the death regardless. And he uses slash damage and is also weak against crush damage. So you want to be using the bronze plate set and a hammer or the brute's club if you have it, and a phoenix pet. And once again, as similar with the Alpha Buck, if you have the full set of the appropriate armor, the pet won't add any additional simply because you've already reduced the damage to the 10 damage minimum. So here's a series of videos showing the Alpha Buck and the Wisp. So first off, fighting the Alpha Buck, we see that we have the full bronze brigandine armor, which is the crush resistance set. I use the bronze coated spear. Typically I would just use my legendary brutes club, but for the purpose of this video I show using the spear. Next off, we're at the Wisp waterfall area and I'm using the bronze plate armor. And I will be using the bronze coated hammer again instead of my legendary brutes club for the purposes of demonstrating with the video. And it's important to actually ideally go into these fights without full health and start using a bandage right away to get that ticking, and then you use your hammer or a spear if you so desire to defeat the Wisp. And he does take a fair amount of damage, and you do need to be on top of your healing, otherwise you will most definitely die. Okay, face tanking the brute. Now this is something I enjoyed in the last event, and as far as I could see I was the only person to do so effectively on a consistent basis. And that's in relation to a few different reasons. First off, you need the full bronze brigandine armor, which is the crush resistance armor. You want a owl pet, ideally the legendary owl pet when the proper resistances are implemented. And you're going to want the 2 epic siphon of chaos rings for that additional 10% crush resistance. Now there's only a few players in the game who have all of those things, first off. The next thing is you're going to want a legendary brutes club. And at the present I'm the only person with a legendary brutes club plus all those other things. And you pretty much need all of those and potentially even more to do this. So that's probably why I was the only person to actually do this. Now there's a few pros to face tanking the brute. So you may be like, why even bother doing this? It significantly increases the overall raid DPS. As we can see from some videos, when this is done properly, nobody needs to move. And if nobody's moving, then everyone's getting all their shots on the boss. And ideally people are not blocking each other. So you have much higher DPS uptime. And you can cut down kills from being multiple minutes to, we had one kill that was about 35 seconds when I fought him with multiple people with brute clubs. Now the importance of doing this, if you can nuke the boss down very quickly, then you should have time to make it to another brute boss, whether you physically run to him or whether you log off via disconnect or Alt F4 and log on to a new character elsewhere. The faster you can get down one means the faster you can get down others to maximize your chaotic trace looting. From my own perspective, this was something that was actually providing a challenge, and in a game that I otherwise find to be very easy at the present, at least with all of the NFTs and stuff that I have. I understand from most new players' perspectives they find this game very difficult, although once you have the NFTs and you've got enough experience it becomes very easy. Now there are some cons to this. A huge one is that you lose about 40% of your own DPS. And that's because there's a couple second delay every 5 seconds to use a bandage. If you're doing less DPS, that means you're doing less damage. If you're doing less damage, you get less percentage of the loot, particularly chaotic trace. So when you're tanking like this, you're essentially taking one for the team. It's also incredibly consumable intensive, so nobody else will really need to use any consumables other than the odd repair powder, but they certainly, if you're tanking well, shouldn't need to use any bandages whatsoever. Another issue is that you aggro everything. Healing that much causes massive aggro around you, so all of the goblin hunters come to you, which is not much of an issue because you can just DPS them down because they physically come to you. The major issue are the goblin archers, which with this setup do about 6 damage per hit, and once you get multiple of them on you plus the brute is attacking you, unless the brute dies very quickly, they become a problem. 1 or 2 goblin archers I can usually handle, but more than that and you risk dying even in a high DPS group. For the most part, nobody bothers to actually help you by just killing the goblin archers that are standing right next to them while they just tunnel the boss. Now there are a few ways to actually increase your aggro if you choose to tank. One is DPSing from the mob's front. If you're from the front, you tend to cause more threat than attacking him from behind. And you want to take and heal damage, so you actually want to get hurt. By getting hurt allows you to use bandages. Using bandages causes healing, which generates a lot of threat. Using food to replenish your energy also seems to cause some threat. Something interesting, which I don't actually show in the upcoming videos, but actually works incredibly well, it almost works like a taunt, is opening your inventory. Several times if I've actually lost threat because of chain of weak hits or whatever, or someone else pulled aggro initially, opening my inventory was usually enough to get the mob back onto me. Of course, doing a lot of DPS certainly helps to generate threat, and something which I don't recommend but does seem to contribute to threat is wearing the wrong gear. Now we have a series of videos showing the tanking. So this is Gulliver who provided this video, showing a third-person perspective of myself face tanking the brute. And you can see there's a lot of people fighting this brute. Everyone's fairly evenly spread around, meaning there's a huge amount of uptime on this brute. And the whole point of face tanking is not having to move at all. And as you can see, me there on the left with the Brutes Club, I don't move at all during this entire encounter. Now, the first half of the encounter, where he's just doing his light attacks, is very easy to heal through. You start to get negative healing once he starts doing his smash attack in the second phase, but with enough DPS, that shouldn't be an issue. Now, Gulliver's not actually hitting him right here because somebody walked in front of him. But typically, as long as people aren't jumping around like some people are doing right now and completely unnecessary, this boss would go down much quicker and everybody would maximize their earnings. He died. Here I'm going to show from my perspective what it's like fighting the brute from a tanking perspective. And as I entered the combat there, I entered without full health because I immediately want to get the threat from bandages, and I entered with less than full energy because I want to generate the threat from using my food as well. Now, you also want to make sure that you're not full health at all times. You want to be just slightly less than full health so that the ticks of your bandages are always counting. And your bandages tick 4 or 5 times. It's either 10, 5, 5, 5, and 15, or 10, 5, 5, and 20, depending on its batch server cycles. So here's a version of me fighting the brute solo to better show the kind of damage that you take with perfect gear. And this is the plus 20% crush resistance, as you can see from the bottom left there. I have 3 crush bars and everything is maxed out. And for the most part, I'm not even healing all of the time because I'm easily surviving his attack. His light attack that he does when he just does a side swing like that only does 15 damage to me, and you can see that specifically by pressing F11 twice up in the top left to see your actual health numbers instead of just the bar. When he does switch to phase 2, he'll start doing his smash attack, and his smash attack will do up to 45 damage. Now, he does a couple of different patterns. So in this most recent milestone, they increased his frequency of his smash attack, or you could say they decreased the cooldown. Previously I was able to attack him 7 times between smashes. Now I can only do 5 or 6, so he does quite a bit more DPS than he used to. Despite that, he also does different attack patterns. Sometimes he does 2 light attacks in a smash, sometimes he does 1 light attack in a smash. What you want to see is him only doing a smash every 3rd hit. So him doing 2 light attacks in a smash, you can actually out-heal that with perfect gear and timing. So typically what you want to do is you want to get a couple of attacks in, then use, so I should have used a bandage there, I got a little bit behind. And you want to start spamming your bandage just before it runs out. So 2 seconds left on your bandage tick, that's when you want to start spamming your bandage, so you have pretty much a bandage up at all times. And it's possible that you can get a last bandage tick and a first bandage tick at the same time, which is a 30 health heal from that 1 second. It's hard to time though. And as you can see, I'm taking quite a bit of damage. I'm just barely keeping up. Now, if I wasn't repairing my gear earlier, it wouldn't be a problem. But in a full group, the second phase only lasts about 30 to 40 seconds. So to face Tank the Brute, you only need to survive that long. The Humble Beginnings event, which was the event that just concluded, did introduce some new NFTs. 3 NFTs in particular: the Humble Beginnings Mystery Chest, and within that were 3 other NFTs. There was the Fintan's Wooden Handle with a 60% drop rate and increased your chaotic trace score when looting by 20%. The Fintan's Crude Handle, which had a 30% drop rate from the crate and increased your chaotic trace by 30%. And finally, the Epic Fintan's Point Handle, which only had a 10% drop rate but increased your chaotic trace by 50%. Now, the most important thing is these are all trinkets, and if you have all 3 trinket slots filled with these, you got an additional 100% bonus. And given that the rate limiting step of this is the Epic, it essentially worked out that the Epic was worth 150% bonus chaotic trace score, which was significantly valuable. Now, the chests were fixed at a price of $25 per crate, which at the time was about 1,500 Gala tokens. Relatively cheap. In the future, these Fintan's trinkets will also increase dual daggery mastery, which isn't implemented yet, and we'll go into it a little bit further in the future here. Fintan's Handle NFTs. So, starting with the one on the left, the uncommon, Fintan's Wooden Handle. Fintan's Training Dagger Handle. The original wooden blade is now a mere vestige, its form all but lost the countless hours of practice. Then the center we have the rare Fintan's Crude Handle. The hilt bears the rough marks of its first kill, a beast in the wilds, not a man. The raw, unrefined nature of the handle is a stark reminder of the assassin's humble and violent start. And ending with the epic Fintan's Point Handle. The handle is a symbol of his transformation and marks the moment his work moved beyond the untamed wilds and into the silent world of shadow and blood. And these humble beginnings is essentially telling the story of how Fintan started up until how he became this legendary master assassin. And these trinkets are aspects of his life, essentially, is kind of the lore behind this. Now, as I said, this was added as part of the Humble Beginnings event. They are planning to add a dual dagger mastery, as can seen in the descriptions. However, mastery in itself is not currently implemented, and even if it was implemented, it wouldn't really help, considering that dual daggers are also not implemented. At the present also, unlike the Siphon of Chaos Rings, which will have future shadow protection, and in the interim have been added crush resistance, these Fintan handles do not provide any interim benefits. So after the event, as of right this very moment, they have no real purpose other than look pretty in your inventory screen. Searching on NFT Harbor, I did find 4 other NFTs which have not been released yet. I should make note that this slide is complete speculation, although I also speculate to be 100% accurate. And that will be the September event, which is going to be named Desperate Measures. And we have a new crate for Desperate Measures, which looks similar to the other crates, just a different color. This one's kind of more greenish. I suspect it'll have the same price, and Gala's in a similar price, and it comes with 3 NFTs. The Lysandra's Stirring Rod, Lysandra's Pestle, and the Lysandra's Mortar. And based on that, you can assume that this is going to probably increase alchemy in some way. Whether that increases the effectiveness of your potions, increases your mastery in terms of crafting potions, or potentially the amount of potions you create, or some other form of alchemy bonus is yet to be seen. The drop rates and the percent increase in chaotic trace in addition to the set bonus are assumed. However, given that the design is almost identical to the August event and that the drop rates have been consistent across events, I would highly expect it to be 60%, 30%, and 10% for uncommon, rare, and epic respectively. As these are all trinkets, you can assume that they can all be worn, and wearing all of them will likely also cause a set bonus as per the previous event. Moving on to the last event's leaderboards of Humble Beginnings. This was a close event. However, in the end, I was able to nudge ahead and once again secure the top rank spot for the leaderboards with a score of 18 million. The next highest was Abdo, also within the Mom Guild, clocking in at a solid 10 million. Below that was quite a tight race. It was really down to the wire with multiple people. Between third and fourth place, you can see there's only 4,500 points different, which is almost nothing, honestly. There were a bunch of us in various groups in the Mom Discord. I'm going to give a call out to Webkist, Havoc, Rock, Satoshi Sean, Gulliver, Atlas, the Marquis, and Caltoon, all of which have been either on voice or at least heavily within the Discord. Missing from this list was XG, who was having some issues with his account due to excess NFTs, so hopefully we see him significantly up on the leaderboard in this September event. Important thing that I'm noticing is that Mom, the Masters of Materium, are absolutely dominating in the leaderboards. The core Mom groups on Discord overall perform better as well in ranking compared to the last test, so we're working better as a team overall. And interestingly enough, despite this competition only being 4 days compared to the previous 5 days, and for record, I think the 4-day event is perfect actually. Scores were actually, for the most part, higher, which shows that people are executing their playing better and also went in with much better preparation. Now, because the event was a lot closer in terms of scores for the most part, a lot to do with how the NFTs were layered. This did result in more toxic behaviors, such as blocking shots, nudging people to move them or knocking them off cliffs, leashing mobs, etc. And I admit that I did spend some time after I was at the top score and pretty much confirmed my victory that I did some of these things just to have a little fun at the end of the test. But for the most part, as people know, I spent most of the time tanking, which was essentially taking one for literally anyone else that was in my group. In terms of event strategies, and this can account for the previous event, the current event, and potentially even future events, huge thing is stocking consumables. So bandages. First off, I personally have thousands on many different exemplars. Many thousands. And on my main, I don't even know how many's on my main. Food, you want to also craft thousands of bread, which is really easy to do because barley is evergreen, so you can literally stand in one place and just craft that. Potions just recently came out. My suggestion, depending on how you're doing things, you probably want to craft hundreds if you're actually traveling. If you're using the teleporting method, you probably don't need all that many, simply because you won't be jumping anywhere. You'll be just standing in place and logging in, logging out on different exemplars. Which then comes to gearing exemplars. Having multiple exemplars is a huge advantage, especially when they're all fully geared and stocked, and having one at every major brute location, and even having a few extras. Like myself personally on the last playtest, for about 30 hours I couldn't actually use my character with my legendary brutes club, and that character also had the vast majority of my consumables, which put me at a significant disadvantage. Taking that into account, the account that I was kind of just fooling around at the end, and also that I was tanking, if I wasn't doing all those, I suspect my score would have ended closer to the 25 million mark. Anyway, at a bare minimum, you do want to have the full bronze brigandine armor, which is for fighting the brute, and you want to have the tough leather sets. If there's a large amount of goblins, you might want to switch to that to kill them. Also, if you're trying to farm bones, having the tough leather set is useful. And when you're using the tough leather set, you typically want to be using the sword, and if you're using the bronze brigandine armor, you're probably going to want to use the bronze coated, I said bronze tipped, there's actually called bronze toted spear. or if you have the Legendary Brutes Club, you just use the Legendary Brutes Club in all cases. Next is communicating with others. So when I'm playing, I'm on Discord literally 100% of the time, and that helps a huge amount. So having multiple people scout different areas, you know where players are, so you know which brutes to attack next, approximately when you can attack them, etc. Having to avoid or mitigate bugs, unfortunately, is a major potential advantage. So if someone says that Purgatory is down, then you're probably not going to want to use the on-stuck feature to teleport, otherwise you'll get your character stuck in Purgatory. Also, scouting with the cogwheel bug. So if you log out of a character and immediately log into another character, you will not be able to use the weapons on the new character you log in. When you look in your inventory, you'll see a little cogwheel over it, which means you'll have to log out and then log back in again. So you'll need a double login to use a new character. Now you can actually use this to your advantage. So let's say you're at the green camp and you're planning to fight the brute at the yellow camp or the brown camp next. Well, if you're planning to go to the yellow camp, what you can do is first log into the brown camp as a scout, because you can't use that character because he won't be able to use his weapons, and then log in to the yellow camp's exemplar. While you do that, you'll be able to use the yellow camp's exemplar for fighting right away, and you've also scouted the brown to know if you should go then to the brown camp or instead say to the large camp or do something else, because neither are good options. The last thing is, of course, getting the NFTs. The NFTs are very overpowered, completely pay to win, and almost essential for most people to rank to any significant amount. Myself personally, I would rank actually really high even if I didn't have any of the NFTs, but for most people, if you want to actually rank to any significant amount, you're going to have at least some of the event NFTs. Okay, on to future events and rewards, the first slide. So on the left here, the dev team released a event feedback form, which I would recommend anyone to complete because they are interested in wondering about people's participation, potential rewards, and if you've enjoyed it or not. And future events will be shaped based on this input, so it is worth completing. The current rewards are only Gala tokens, which are in fairly small quantity, and given the amount of effort, is hardly worth it from a financial perspective. Like, my ROI means that I probably was making about $1 per hour given all the prep time, play time, and the cost of the NFTs. And that's with the rank 1 place. So from a direct financial perspective, the Gala rewards alone are not really that enticing. Another thing of interest is that Townstar and Vexy, not alone do they pay more, but they require far less effort than the Mirandus event. And the Mirandus event also requires significant preparation. So the rewards do feel very weak in Mirandus compared to what they should be from a time perspective. Additional event rewards, such as higher event-related NFTs, say Legendary or Ancient for top-rated players, would be much bigger draws. Materium would be nice to have. All of these things, of course, in addition to the Gala rewards. In-game titles, potentially some cosmetics, or even potentially some store NFTs that have been sold in the past but have not sold out, or potential store NFTs that have not been yet for sale. So lots of potential better rewards than the current Gala-only rewards. So the current event design for the last 2 events, and potentially for the next few events, is killing goblins of all kinds and looting chaotic trace. So there's a few pros to that. It's very quick and easy to implement. It's easy to plan in advance for. You know where the brutes are, you know where the goblins are, you know what equipment to wear, and it really syncs well with NFTs that increase that score. You loot the chaotic trace, you take the NFTs, multiply it by your NFT value, you're on the leaderboard for that amount. So very easy and directly proportional. Cons, of course, is it's very grindy. It's a lot of work and very repetitive. So far, there's also been no variety, and people will get burned out eventually if they keep having to do the same thing for every single event. Also, it doesn't require a whole lot of skill. Like I said for myself, tanking was quite a bit more skill involved, trying to hold aggro, mitigate damage, and the like. But otherwise, you could like close your eyes and just press your attack button for the most part, and that's really all you needed to do. For future events, could be several different things. So instead of just killing goblins all the time, we could kill potentially other mobs. Wolves, deer, rabbits, the wisp, alpha buck, who knows. Also, they could temporarily buff certain weapons. So instead of using the spear constantly, or the brute's club if you have it instead, they could temporarily buff, say, the sword, or daggers, or bows, or something, to mix things up a little bit. And that would also make it so players would become more skilled on using other weapons. The other thing is a potential race to first kill. So the original Mother's design was the first to kill Mother, and that was later changed to every kill of Mother. However, a race to first kill, despite being a potential shorter event, depending on how much gearing time and stuff is associated with it, would be something interesting. So let's say they do an event on a fresh server, not deleting all of people's previous progress, but just for the event, starting with a fresh character until, say, the first person to kill a brute that is fully geared. So even naked, you could technically kill a brute if you cheese it, so you'd have to rule out that. Now, the pros for this, obviously it's going to increase player satisfaction if they have some variety. That will also relate to decreased player burnout. And the current design is all about how much you play. This will be more about how well you play. So it really promotes and values skill. Of course, this will likely be harder to implement, and players such as myself that play more during the off-event time in terms of preparation will not be rewarded quite as much as they are in the current design. So this sort of thing would not benefit me as much, but I would adapt as necessary. Next, the slide on the legendary brute drops, and even Oprah is jumping in on this one. See, you get a club, you get a club, everyone gets a club. From my perspective, it certainly feels like that, given that I acquired my club from when the drop rate was much more difficult. But as you can see, pretty much everyone has a club now. In the screenshot on the right, that wasn't a planned screenshot. That was just us waiting for a brute. And as you can see, just in that screenshot alone, there's 3 people with the legendary brutes club. Now, in terms of the drop rate, the most recent event substantially increased the club drop rate, which resulted in a single club being dropped in over a month, which was my one, to 3 clubs dropping in a period of about 28 hours. The non-event club drop rate was designed initially to be slightly worse than the total first event's brute kills. However, the team has recently announced that their analytics on the total number of brute kills was incorrect, which means that they made the drop rate for the brutes club far lower than what it should be. Of note, there's another person that recently got a non-event brutes club as well, and I suspect that the drop rate has been adjusted now to be the correct, much less restrictive drop rate that it was originally designed. So who's in the club? Myself, of course. I got mine in the non-event, and I acquired mine at the Brown Goblin Camp. Then in the event, there were 3 dropped from Sinister Grin, Danny 777, D Stock, and those came in at the Large Goblin Camp, the Green Goblin Camp, and the Yellow Goblin Camp respectively. And Dr. Byrne, who just recently got him outside of an event, and that was back at the Brown Goblin Camp. So we're seeing that it went brown, large, green, yellow, brown. So what, is the Large Goblin Camp going to be the next one to drop? Or maybe even one of the rarer spawns? Say the Wolf's Cave or the Stonehenge area, if those get added to events at some point in the future, or if the next one happens to be a non-event drop as well. Given that they should not really matter where the mob is, that shouldn't make a difference. However, it is interesting to see this pattern. Now here's a short video just showing what the new visual effects that have been added to the Brutes Club, and you can see in my paper doll there, the Brutes Club have that red aura. And then on the main screen again, you can kind of see the red aura, but not all that great considering the Brutes Club extends beyond the screen. Chaotic Trace. So this is the primary resource from the events to determine your leaderboard score. As per the previous events, normal goblins drop between 130 to 380, and those include the goblin archers and the goblin hunters. And then the brutes usually drop 40,000 per kill, although very rarely drop 20,000, a little more commonly drop 70,000, which I refer to as the fatty. In the bottom left there you can see a fatty that I soloed, which was 70,000 chaotic trace. A very nice reward, especially with the 3x from the event NFTs. That's 210,000 points on the leaderboard from a single goblin. Now they do stack up to 1 million each, and each event has its own color of chaotic trace. The Glimpse into the Unknown had a purple color. The most recent event, Humble Beginnings, have a red color. The new Desperate Measures event, my guess is going to be a green color, but we'll find out soon enough. And the fact that even after the event, these items remain in your inventory is suggestive that they'll probably be used for something in the future. And the devs have been asked this, and although they haven't gave any concrete answers, they also didn't confirm that they won't be used, which is suggestive that there will be some use at some point. What can we potentially use these for? Number one thing, and I think the most reasonable thing, is upgrading event-related NFTs. For example, in the Glimpse into the Unknown, you had the Siphon of Chaos, and Epic was the highest rarity NFT you could get. If they're not going to reward higher level NFTs to higher ranked players on the leaderboard, it would at least make sense to potentially use your Chaotic Trace to upgrade those, but only upgrade the Epic, otherwise that will decrease the sales of the boxes themselves. And doing this will also probably increase the sale of the boxes because people know that they can upgrade to get higher tier, that being legendary or even ancient status. Trading them for titles, say like Brute Killer or Goblin Killer or whatever, maybe some cosmetics, maybe an extra glow, different color glows to your weapon, different colors of your armor, maybe beards, mustaches, etc. Potentially using them in place of various potion ingredients, very similar to the original design for Materium. The most likely case, which I don't want to see, is that they simply look pretty in your inventory and forever remind you of how much time you spend collecting it. On to Materium. On the top left, they have the old Materium symbol from the original Mirandus team, which is also the design for the Masters of Materium's Materium symbol. And on the top right, we have the new design for the Materium. What can you use Materium for? So out of the game, you can just hodl it, which is probably the most common use. You can buy things occasionally from the Gala store, but nothing in the last year or two. You can use in liquidity pools, although there's very, very little liquidity. And you can also use it for bids or asks, etc. on NFT Harbor, although it's not commonly used. So what do we actually use it in the game for? So the Temple Healing, you can use 5 Materium for a partial heal or 10 for a full heal. If you're in Purgatory and you want to resurrect instantly with full energy and health, you can use 30 Materium. If you want to repair, and that includes at the Simple Forge or the Large Forge, or if you want to repair via Repair Powder, you need to use 15 Materium for every 50% worth of durability repaired. You, of course, could just hodl it within the game, and that's what probably most of the people are doing who have excess amounts. Or you can do what I do and simply watch it to go to 0 over and over again due to bugs, and I will go into that in the bug slide. The major problem currently with Materium is that after you initially fully gear up, you acquire it at a rate that's far beyond what you need to actually spend, and there's really nothing to spend it on. Looking at the Materium chart there, we have seen that the Materium price has been increasing consistently. My personal thought that it's insanely overvalued compared to how easy it is to acquire in game. If I didn't get reset to 0 multiple times, I'd have well over 1 million Materium without even really trying to acquire it in a fairly short period of time. Given how little effort it took, and that's just one exemplar playing, that's not even using all my NFTs like my various towns and buildings, etc. I do think the Materium value is probably overpriced by a factor of 10. Anyway, potential solutions in game. They could increase the Materium costs to replace lesser bone marrow. So instead of spending 15 Materium to make a lesser bone marrow, maybe cost 100 Materium and then not have to use a bone at all. That would certainly significantly increase use. Temple buffs. which was the original design. The current team has it so the temple healing actually heals hit points, where the healing was meant to originally heal you from like curses and hexes and status conditions. It wasn't actually meant to heal your hit points. That was designed for the in line of building: tent, camp, large inn, grand inn, majestic inn. So having them provide various buffs, whether that's more damage or resistance or something, would be something that people would definitely take advantage of. Teleporting between cemeteries could be a reasonable option. And magic in the game obviously is going to be a major use of Materium, as that Materium is magic in itself, although that is not yet implemented. So I mentioned perfect gear in the past, but I didn't really go into what it is. And I've had multiple people ask me, well, what NFTs can I get to improve my character? The image on the left shows what perfect inventory looked like as of a few days ago. First off, you want stacks of bandages. You want 1,000 plus. You want solid meat, which restores 40% energy instead of the 20% normal. And you want plenty of potions. Currently only the fall potions, and you probably want a good stack of 100 plus of those. Of note, in my image I only have stacks of 100 and I have no potion. And that's because they only allowed you to stack more than 100 in Milestone 10, and potions were also only implemented in Milestone 10, which is after this screenshot was taken. You also want to have the best of each weapon. You want the bronze coated spear for pierce damage. You want the bronze coated sword for slash damage. And ideally the legendary brutes club for crush damage. Of course, if you can't get the legendary brutes club, then you can get the bronze coated hammer so that you have the best of each type of damage type. Next is you're going to want a full trinket set. Typically you're going to want the 3-set bonus. However, you could also considering having a Vox, which increases your energy by 25,000, in addition to 2 other higher rarity trinkets, like a rare and an epic, or potentially 2 epics, depending on how that fits your build. You want a legendary pet, or at least the highest tier of pet in damage resistance for that type. For example, some damage types, uncommon is the rarest pet that you can have to provide resistance for that damage type. But in the case of, say, an owl, owls come in uncommon, rare, epic, and legendary, and at least at the time of recording this they all provided 10% resistance, which probably should be changed at some point. You also want rings. Now you could have rings of discord, which provide a little bit of light, however they don't really provide any other benefit. So you want siphon of chaos rings. Ideally you want 2 epic siphon of chaos rings because they add stacking plus 5% crush resistance each and will have shadow damage in the future. You're going to want the lantern of the sun instead of the bronze lantern. The Lantern of the Sun is an absolute game changer, probably the best NFT you can possibly get. Although you can no longer acquire it now, having an old school Vox necklace also helps, and you can see that in the inventory as well, and it has a match to your exemplar. You want a full matching armor set, so an armor set that's surrounded by the orange outline, which gives you the Awaken bonus, which decreases your damage taken, increases your damage dealt, and increases damage dealt to various mobs that are weak versus that damage type. You could also have a stack of wooden arrows, almost completely useless, but you might as well fill the inventory slot, and of course having 100% durability on everything. There's also the question of the other slots. So there's the instrument slot and the shield slot, which are currently blacked out as they're not yet in the game, and the previous build had a head slot, and the head slot was recently just removed, and personally I think they should re-add a head slot. Armor in games typically are one of your major types of resistance, so not having headgear does seem somewhat odd. Next is upgrading and material sync. So on the left hand side you can see a 6x6 grid of full stacks of bronze bars, and that actually goes up and down significantly more than that. And the point I'm trying to make here is that once you've been playing enough time, you have a significant glut of resources with absolutely nothing to use them for. Very similar to the issue with Materium. And they're only really useful until the point where you're fully geared. And if you're efficient, you can get fully geared within a few hours, even if you're doing so solo. My suggestion on, and it could take some time to implement this, and I don't think it's an absolute priority at the present, but it definitely should be implemented at some point, is the ability to upgrade your weapons and or armor by having a risk of destroying it. Here I give an example of a bronze-coated spear. It would be nice for me to spend resources comparable to making a second bronze-coated spear with the chance to upgrade it to a higher version, say a +1 version, a +2 version, etc. And if that were to fail, then it would simply be destroyed. That would make it so you have an infinite amount of useful resources. And that would also add some value to the resources. It would also add value to the weapons. Say you had a +5 or +10 weapon, that would require a lot of luck and resource gathering to get to that point, and they would have likely significant value. Just crafting a bronze-coated spear otherwise, which they do plan to make as NFTs in the next couple months, likely is not going to have any real value at all, because I know myself personally, I could probably provide enough bronze spears for every player that's playing, and I'd probably do it for free just to clear the stuff out of my inventory. However, if I was able to use them to upgrade, it would be worthwhile. Another thing mentioned was things such as bandages and stuff may not be added as NFTs. Personally, I would take a stack of bandages over a bronze-coated weapon any day, even if I didn't have the Brute's Glove, just because it's more useful and a lot more effort to acquire. Now, doing this would solve multiple issues. One, it would solve the issues of inventories getting overly large, which caused a major bug in the last event, preventing players from logging in. It would also provide more incentive for players to further improve their characters and increase game time, which is definitely useful. Also, something of interest is the higher quality versions, say the +1, etc., you occasionally could get a minor visual change, maybe a colored stripe on the armor or some kind of visual effect similar to what we're seeing with the Brute Club's glow. Next up is the dungeon list, and these dungeons' names have all been confirmed. We have the Skywound Mine, the Uncharted Abyss, the Frozen Womb, and the Obsidian Heart. Now, the Uncharted Abyss, Frozen Womb, and Obsidian Heart, these were all created by AI based on some information I provided, although it does give a kind of general feel of what we could expect these zones to kind of feel like. Skywound Mine is an actual image directly from Skywound Mine near the boss's chamber. Now, the Skywound Mine, of course, is entered from Narrow's Landing, and assuming they are going to use the same names or the same zones that the original team was designing, the Uncharted Abyss, I'm assuming, would probably be branched off of Tidemark, the Frozen Womb likely be the Arid Cold, and the Obsidian Heart from Bastial. Now, something interesting that Benefactor within the past few weeks shared on X is a picture of what looks to be a frost dragon, and given that we know a zone is going to be called the Frozen Womb, it does seem somewhat reasonable that the end boss of the Frozen Womb could potentially be the frost dragon that were pictured here in this concept art. So it's something we'll have to see in the future. Regardless though, if these dungeons are all along the same lines of the Skywound Mine in 1 square kilometer each, they will be quite something to look towards. Myself personally, I was very surprised by Skywound Mine in its absolute giant size. I was expecting something much, much smaller, to say the least. Moving on to fake walls and parkour. So fake walls is something the dev team recently announced, and it's very interesting actually. It reminds me significantly to the cracked walls in Zelda, where you kind of see a little something being a little off. You drop a bomb there and it blows open the wall, or you kind of push on the wall and it opens, etc. And these sort of things could lead to several things. They could lead to some information in the game, possibly treasures, maybe some other secret areas, and they will be coming in an update in the near future. Now, I did have a good look around Skywound Mine, kind of pressing on the walls all the way around, and I didn't notice anything as of yet, but Skywound Mine also didn't have traps and stuff, which was promised. So when it comes to things like parkour, given the amount of verticality, say in Skywound Mine, and the fact that we have this new fall potion, that does leave a lot of options for parkour and potentially some jumping puzzles, etc. Parkour was, of course, used extensively in the rolling metal zone, trying to jump across the rocks to avoid the wolves, making your way to the golden rabbit. Also, it was significantly required to make it over to Mother's Island in that zone, and was also required to make it up to the tree, to the platform in the Splinterwoods area, which is no longer accessible as of Milestone 5. Having these sorts of things in the game does significantly promote exploration of literally everywhere, so every nook and cranny, trying to find these hidden and secret areas. And it can be rewarding from a loot perspective or even vistas. So say you parkour up to some area, you get a nice view of an area, and you might be able to, from that view, see something you potentially couldn't see before. And occasionally even, in some games, provide titles for similar kind of achievements. At the very least, they add a significant amount of side content and additional depth to the game and additional playability. So I think both of these things are quite good, and if implemented correctly, will add significant amount to the game. Next is rare drops, and having them also on normal mobs. Now on the far right there we see a brute with a club and a sword, and the brute I can't confirm is a normal mob or not. My guess is probably not, and I can't confirm because I can't see their minimum damage. Nonetheless, let's focus here on mobs that we know for sure are normal, say the Goblin Archer, the Goblin Hunter of the various camps. Now, I previously mentioned on the upgrading slide that you could be nice to be able to upgrade gear to say +1 or +2. However, it'd be also interesting if mobs could drop, say, either unique sets or upgraded versions of our current sets if that was not a possibility with the previous upgrade. And I'll give an example here, and this can apply to any of them. So the brown goblins could potentially drop a bronze-coated hammer. The green goblins could potentially drop a bronze-coated sword, and the yellow goblins could drop a, say, bronze-coated spear. Now, the brown and the yellow goblins could be switched as well based on the way that they drop essences, but you kind of get the point that I'm saying, that various mobs could drop various things based on what they're weak to. Now, this can be further expanded. For example, let's say the Goblin Hunters at the green camp could potentially drop tough leather boots +1 or some other specific boot, and then the Goblin Archers at the green camp could then drop, say, another thing, say gloves. And then if you had, say, the brutes at each camp, say you had a green brute, a yellow brute, and a brown brute, well, the brute of that particular type could then drop, say, the chest piece, all as fairly rare drops, which would add additional replayability to these areas and these mobs. Also, the fact that if you had brutes of each different type, say a spear brute, a sword brute, and a club brute, then you're getting brutes that have all the different damage types, so people don't just always wear bronze brigandine armor and use spears. They start actually taking advantage of the much lack of love armor, the bronze plate, and potentially even using the toughened leather, depending on what mobs you're fighting against. Next up, the mob AI and some spawn limits. And this image I've shown once before, and on the right hand side here we can see at the large goblin camp at the very north, there's mobs that spawn there and they tend to get stuck. And this getting stuck typically happens if a bunch of mobs are dying elsewhere and nobody's aggroing them in this area. One mob sticks the other, and then every other mob gets stuck on top of them. And get these like huge looking blob creatures, and when you do eventually aggro them, because they can't walk properly and they have collision, they walk on top of each other. And I've seen them up as high as like 7 or 8 goblins high. These like huge goblin towers. There's a few different places that this tends to happen. So at the large goblin camp we can see the one where I mentioned. At the brown goblin camp, when you're entering from the north entrance looking towards the sacrificial altar, on the left hand side where the altar platform goes to the down ramp, they tend to get stuck there. At the yellow camp, when walking up towards the highest elevation of the yellow camp, just on the east side or the right side of the old cheese rock that got nerfed. They tend to get stuck there. The green camp, when you're entering from the south, there's a rock when you come into the opening area, and just on the left they tend to get stuck there as well. And this same error or issue with mob AI and spawning happens at all those locations. Now, spawning in this game is quite interesting compared to most games. For example, say in World of Warcraft, mobs have certain spawn locations, and once you kill them, after so many minutes or seconds or whatever, or hours even in some cases, they respawn in that location. In this game it's different. So let's say you're at the Yellow Goblin camp and you kill all the goblins at the Yellow Goblin camp. Those goblins, some of them will respawn at the Yellow Goblin camp, but some of them will respawn, say, in the Large Goblin camp. And then let's say you kill the remaining mobs at the Yellow Goblin camp. Well, say half of those will then go to Large Goblin camp. As you clear out an area, less and less mobs stay in that area. And the same applies to resource nodes. Now, this is an interesting dynamic because it forces you to move around the map to harvest resources and force you to go to different areas to kill mobs. However, it does tend to cause the problems that I'm currently describing. And depending on how fast these mobs die, you can have bigger issues. Also, if there's a ton of people playing, you can essentially have it so you're killing mobs so fast that there's no mobs literally anywhere on the map. And we notice that during the events. The other thing is mobs, because they don't all spawn at once, say for example in World of Warcraft you go to a little group of say 5 mobs, you kill them, they all die, they respawn 5 minutes later, you can just go and loot them. In this case mobs tend to spawn one at a time, just spread out just enough so that they keep interrupting you while you're trying to loot, which is incredibly annoying. The other thing with regards to harvestable nodes is that a lot of the easier areas tend to get farmed out, and then new players in particular have struggled to try to harvest the nodes in the areas that are harder to get to. And oftentimes you'll say, oh well, a copper spawns at this area, and the new player will kind of just camp that area hoping that something respawns, but it will never respawn unless someone mines copper at some other place, in which case it has the probability of spawning at the area that you're in. So although I do kind of like this system, it definitely needs a little bit of work to affect the spawn limits so that you don't have areas where it's so overcrowded that you can't loot anything and that you can't actually interact with things. On to the bug slide. So many of the bugs that I've mentioned in previous videos still persist. The nasty cogwheel bug, which was kind of the bane of existence within the last event, especially for those trying to do the teleport strategy, although I did mention one way to utilize that in terms of scouting. Materium going to 0. I have a screenshot there of me having 690,000 Materium. Actually got as high as 747,000 Materium at one point before going all the way back to 0. And during the last event I had it go back to 0 6 times in total. At the present, I'd probably have, I don't know, maybe 1.5 million Materium or something if that didn't keep happening. When they do decide to make Materium an actual real Materium instead of just test Materium, this bug absolutely needs to be corrected because it's absolutely game breaking. Probably should be the priority #1 bug to fix. The awakening overlay bug that I previously described still persists. There's this gear blackening bug which occurred previously, although I've noticed it's quite a bit more common, and it's very similar to the cogwheel bug but only happens with armor instead of weapons. The zone failing to load seems to be happening more and more often, especially with Skywound Mine and Purgatory, and I find this happens probably 70 or to 80% of the time. I assume every time I change zones I probably have to Alt F4 and reload into the game. There is a new major bug though that definitely needs to be fixed as a high priority associated with this particular test, and in the screenshot on the right you can see what that is. So in the screenshot I have a legendary owl and 2 epic Siphon of Chaos rings, which should be providing me with plus 20% crush resistance on 3 separate buffs, although you can see over my health bar I have absolutely no buffs. And what happens is every time you change zones or log in and log out, you lose all of your buffs, and the only way to get back those buffs is on equipping your items and re-equipping them. So it's not just a visual bug, it actually affects your total resistance as well. And when you're equipping your gear, you have a high probability of acquiring the the gear blackening bug, which then requires you to Alt F4 again, which of course resets your buffs again. So you kind of get in this cycle where it sometimes takes multiple logins just to get your buffs back. So that's something that definitely will need to be changed. Now on to the final thoughts. First off, I'd like to say that this image here I got from the Marquis, also known as Mr. Sorbonne, and this is an actual screenshot from the game where you can see how crazy some of these interactions with mobs get. They're literally like an entire army of goblins on top of each other. So what do I think about this milestone? Well, I'm quite impressed actually. The Skywound Mine being an entire zone, as in full zone size, surprised me. I was expecting it just to be like a small dungeon, but it literally is an actual full zone. The potions shop and stand seems to be implemented well. It would be nice to see many more potions, however. Fall damage, I think they did a really good job on. It's very well tuned, and the potion of fall damage resistance they have included looks good. The additional AI for the mobs, like the Alpha Buck and the Wisp, helps to kind of keep you on your toes. The events, I think, need a little bit of additional work in terms of the variety and the rewards associated with them. Some additional systems, of course, will need to be implemented. I'm looking forward to the fake walls, more parkour, looking to the more zones and dungeons. We're still quite a bit of ways on deeds and buildings, although apparently there's a new team working towards that. Also, the current dev team has been expanded, and the rate of development has been increasing significantly. It does seem like the current dev team has developed some nice pipelines to accelerate the development, which was supposedly the original design for removing the previous team. And we are actually seeing some acceleration at this point. Sales on OpenSea, again, have been increasing on the buy side, whether that's related to improvements with the game or just general increase in market conditions. Materium is following that as well. Having these monthly events is getting more players to join in. I noticed on our Discord, this is the first month since the team got fired, that our Discord numbers actually increased. Also, a lot of older names have been rejoining us in terms of Discord and in-game. And I can see a general increase in interest within the game. So overall, I'm seeing a lot of good signs here. I'm seeing very little negative perspectives, and even some people that were completely out are actually interested in getting back in. So I think things are looking up forward. In that regard, I will be playing this next September event to the best of my ability. I will make another video following Milestone 11 and potentially even following this Desperate Measure event if there's enough changes compared to the Glimpse in the Unknown and the Humble Beginnings event. And that's all for now, and I hope everyone has enjoyed this very long video. Goodbye.